Have you ever wondered how much it would actually cost to own every Nintendo game ever released? Well, I have, and today we're finally getting an answer. As a hardcore Wii U loyalist in the 2010s, I bought nearly every Nintendo published game on the system, with one horrible game that was as much as a brand new Switch 2 at one point, stopping me from having a complete collection. That got me thinking, if one Wii U game can cost that much, how expensive would it be to collect every physical Nintendo game across every system? To figure it out, I brought in Fritter, who owns more than 3,000 physical games. But before we start, here are the ground rules. Now pause the video to read them, or you can check the description below. While the Nintendo Entertainment System wasn't Nintendo's first console, it was their first cartridge-based console released in North America, as Nintendo had launched the Famicom 2 years earlier in Japan with cartridges. But for what we got in North America, the NES launched over 40 years ago and had just over 70 Nintendo published releases. So technically it's 72, but you can say 74 if you want to count some special competition cartridges. Those just bring on a whole different conversation. A graded gray one sold for over $78,000 in 2024, and a graded gold one sold for over $207,000 the same year, so no single number really covers them. I'm just gonna move on before I take out a loan for these. Surprisingly, the vast majority of loose games are really cheap here. Even most of the big names like your Marios and Zeldas are rarely above 35 bucks, with many of Nintendo's games being under $20, making it a very attractive option for a new collector or just someone who wants to build up their existing NES library. There are some exceptions, however. Stack Up goes for $204, and Donkey Kong Jr. Math goes for $192. And there are of course reasons for this. Donkey Kong Jr. Math was the only game Nintendo ever released under the NES Education series in North America, and it bombed so badly that Bruce Larry, who was Nintendo of America's VP of sales at the time, called it the worst game we ever sold, and said the company couldn't quote-unquote give it away. Very ironic nowadays. Stack Up has a different excuse. It was one of the 2 launch games built for Rob the robot, and a real complete set means more than a box and a manual. It means all the little accessory pieces that came with it too, which is a much easier thing to lose over 40 years than a cartridge. If only I'd spent that money on this cartridge instead of a TI-84 graphing calculator. It was actually super surprising to me how big these 2 outliers are, because the next most expensive game after them is Mega Man 6, which yes was published by Nintendo in North America, and it's only $55. There's really not much else besides those 2 and maybe Mega Man 6 that isn't extremely affordable on this system. But remember, all of that is just the loose prices. Complete in box games are where this really goes up. You see, back in ancient times, which is the 80s and 90s, games didn't come in these nice plastic cases that can take a lot more damage and also are just a lot more practical for holding games. Like you open up a modern plastic game case and there's a holder for the disc or cartridge built right in. The cartridge games back then, and even into the 2000s with the GBA, they just came in these cardboard boxes that wore down fast if you didn't take care of them, and a lot of people just threw them away since it was cardboard. Super Mario Brothers, for example, is just $19 loose, but over $200 with the box and manual. Basically 10 times the cost, which is just insane to me. I could go on and on about the jumps from loose to complete in box, but the one I really want to focus on most is Donkey Kong Jr. Math again. We know it's $192 loose, like still expensive, but not anything too crazy. But with the box, it's $2,826.
Damn!
For the game they literally could not pay people to take. So the total cost of every game that meets our rules for the NES is $1,566 for the games themselves, an average of just $22 a game, but for the boxes and manuals too, it's $10,931, which is an average of $152 a game. There will be some pretty large discrepancies between complete in box and loose games as we continue through the video, but this is by far the biggest one. The Game Boy released in 1989 and was still getting games for nearly a decade later, but surprisingly only has 57 qualifying games, which is a lot lower than I initially thought. There's also Game Boy Color games, but I'm counting those separately and we'll get to those later. Like with the NES, Game Boy games are still relatively cheap. Most sit in that $10 to $25 range, with quite a few even lower. There's some pricier games, of course, but nothing that insane. The NES's most expensive was $204 loose, but here it's Pokemon Red at just $61. Still more than I'd like to pay for a Game Boy game, but all things considered, it's basically the same price as a new Switch game. So yeah, not thrilled about that, but also if you want this bad enough, it's pretty realistic to get. If you have money to burn though, and want all the boxes and manuals, that's of course where the real money comes in. Although it's not nearly as expensive as complete in box NES games, a good amount are still under $50, but when you get to those big names, the prices jump really fast. Super Mario Land 2 is just $20 loose, but over $70 in the box. Metroid 2 is $35 loose and $230 complete. Pokemon Red is $61 loose and $350 complete, and that is the most expensive game Game Boy game I could find. And then also blue is $55 loose and $310 complete. And for those two specifically, it's not really about the cartridge itself, because both of these games sold tens of millions of copies. It's that cardboard boxes just don't survive childhood the way a cartridge does. And when you remember that most people buying this were kids who don't really know how to take care of things, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Now for the totals, every game loose comes out to $1,074, an average of just $19 a game. Complete in box though, it is almost $4,800, which is an average of $84 a game, more than 4 times the loose total. Pokemon gives you the two most extreme examples, but that 4 times jump runs across the entire library, not just the 2 Pokemon games. So again, this is really a cardboard box problem more than an actual Pokemon problem. Cardboard. Despite being home to some of my all-time favorite games ever made, I actually don't own an SNES, which after doing this math might be the smartest financial decision I've ever made. Growing up, I got most of these games through the Super Mario Advance ports on GBA and then Virtual Console on the Wii and Wii U, and even have the SNES Classic, but my whole experience with this library has not actually been with SNES cartridges themselves. There's just 49 games that qualify here, and it's actually a smaller library than it looks, because one game ends up carrying the whole system financially. Know what it is? Comment to show your video game knowledge before I say it. 3, 2, 1. It's Earthbound. Earthbound is $390 loose on its own and $2,600 complete. And like almost everything expensive in this video, it comes down to too few surviving copies chasing too much demand. Nintendo launched it in 1995 at about $70, which might be standard 30 years later, but that was pretty high for the time. It was packed in an oversized box with a full strategy guide and then read ads built entirely around the tagline, "This game stinks," complete with scratch and sniff cards for some reason. I don't even want to know what a 1995 Earthbound scratch card smells like. Anyway, then you add on the game already looking dated next to what else was out that year, and it sold under 150,000 copies in the US and just pretty much disappeared. Then in 1999, the main character Ness showed up in the first Super Smash Bros., which brought a lot more attention to Earthbound. Now this game has been expensive for as far as price charting goes back, but in 2006 it was $60 and it's been as high as $400, so I think it's pretty safe to say that this will only go up. Now not as expensive, but still a crazy amount, is Kirby's Dream Land 3 at $208 loose and $948 complete. And there's no comparable story there, it just came out right as everyone had already moved on to the N64. It's a bad time to release anything on a dying system, and whatever that did to sales likely helped leave fewer copies in circulation today. On the other end, most of the sports and licensed stuff, Super Play Action Football, Battle Clash, NCAA Basketball, it all barely registers here, mostly sitting under $35, even complete in the box, and 10 different games are cheaper on this list to find as the player's choice budget re-release. And if you're building this as cheap as possible, it is definitely worth knowing that going in. There's plenty of other expensive games here, like Super Metroid is $78 loose, $241 complete. Then you have Super Punch-Out at $38 loose, $151 complete. And even Super Mario World, the single most iconic game on the system, is $370 complete, and doesn't even crack the top 5 most expensive SNES games. Also, since some of you might be here for this, the original Star Fox is only $21 loose, but $80 complete. Add all of that up, and SNES comes out to a little more than $1,700 loose, which is a $35 average. Well above the NES average, despite this being a system most people assume should be cheaper since it's only from the early 90s. But complete in box, that jumps to $7,630, which is a $156 average. And Earthbound alone accounts for a huge chunk of that gap. So I don't own an original Virtual Boy, but in a twist that would have sounded made up a year ago, I actually do now own the Nintendo Switch Online version. And unlike some of the other retro apps on that surface, this one actually makes you pay to use it properly. Nintendo added a whole Virtual Boy app to the expansion pack tier in February of this year, and Nintendo's own support page doesn't leave room for interpretation. The games are 3D only, it is not possible to play with 2D images, and you need one of 2 accessories to play it all, a $100 plastic replica stand or a $25 cardboard one, and for some reason I decided to pay $100 for this. Anyway, tangent aside, we're here to talk about the OG system. The Virtual Boy, as we know, was a total bust and made the Wii U look like the PS2. It only has 11 games, which is by far the smallest for any Nintendo system. The cheapest complete game on the entire system, Teleroboxer, is $75, and 11 games in, nothing goes for less than that complete. Mario's Tennis Loose is only $15, which is completely unremarkable, but complete in box, it is $309, 20 times the price for a box and manual on a Virtual Boy sports game no one talks about. 3D Tetris takes the actual crown for the most expensive loose game at $170, and complete it's just over $300. Nothing complete on the system is ever cheap, and the reason is simply only 770,000 of these were actually sold worldwide before Nintendo pulled the plug less than a year after launch, and the games just followed the hardware straight into obscurity. Add it all up and loose, the whole thing is $651, which is a $59 average, and complete in box it's $1,700, which is a $155 average, which is actually very close to the SNES average, but has less than a quarter of the library. It's impressive, but like in a bad way if you're a Virtual Boy console collector. For the Nintendo 64 section, I'm going to hand over the mic to Fritter, since as you can see, he knows a thing or two about this system.
Hey guys, Fritter from Fritter's Game Shrine here, and Domania has graciously requested my assistance on answering some game collecting related questions. The whole how much does everything cost kind of thing is right up my alley. For those who know me, I'm no stranger to spending copious amounts of money on video games. Exhibit A? Exhibit B. Let's talk a little bit about the Nintendo 64, Nintendo's initial foray into the world of 3D polygonal video games. Sure, there were some janky 3D games before this, but I'd argue Nintendo did it best from the get-go. The N64 only has about 296 games that were released in North America, which is pretty small compared to the NES's 677 or the Super Nintendo's 700-something releases, though it's still not the smallest Nintendo library, funny enough. There's 52 Nintendo-published games for this thing, which, despite the 64 having way less total games, is more than the Super Nintendo. You've got your usuals like the Marios, the Zeldas, the Pokemons, but then you have weird ones like a couple Kobe Bryant NBA games. Does that mean Kobe Bryant is a Nintendo character? Anyway, let's say you want all 52 games. What's it going to cost you? Well, personally, I mostly collect loose copies when it comes to cartridge-based consoles. And to get all 52 N64 games, you're looking to spend around $1,650, which sounds like a lot until you consider there's a Nintendo 64 game that costs like $1,400 by itself. Then it starts to sound a lot more reasonable. If you want the boxes, well, you're insane, but I'll humor you. Get ready to spend around $5,700. Yeah, screw that. In fact, don't even attempt that. You'll lose your mind. These kids back in the day did not take care of their stuff. But I mean, how could you blame them? I'm sure they didn't expect cardboard to be valuable 30 years into the future. Trying to collect decent quality cardboard boxes from the late 90s and early 2000s is a real pain in my... Regardless, I have some games in boxes, but it's definitely not my go-to. Some heavy hitters include Paper Mario, Pokemon Stadium 2, and Majora's Mask, which is almost $100 just for the cartridge. The most expensive game on the list, though, is StarCraft 64. Kinda weird Nintendo published this, but it's hovering just around the $100 range. Not really that bad comparatively. Nintendo published some amazing games on the N64 too. This is the console I grew up with. We got two absolutely legendary Zelda games, some of the best Pokemon spin-off games in my opinion. Not you. And the two fantastic Banjo-Kazooie games. They actually published a lot of Rare's games like Killer Instinct, Blast Corps, and GoldenEye, but not Conquer, for pretty obvious reasons. I guess they had to draw the line somewhere. My favorites, though, are the two Bomberman games that they published. Both are very reasonably priced and amazing. Definitely the best bang for your buck. I grew up with both Bomberman games, but I gotta say Hero is my favorite. It's one of the best 3D platformers ever made, with an insane soundtrack, best on the N64 hands down. Bomberman had one more game on the N64 that actually wasn't published by Nintendo, and you can see the discrepancy in the prices. Jeez! In conclusion though, the N64 is a great console to collect for, and you don't need all 52 Nintendo published games, but it's definitely the best selection of games Nintendo had to offer up to this point. And for $1,600, I'd say it's worth it in my opinion.
Thanks, Fritter, and by the way, I'll trade you a copy of Fling Smash for the Wii and Silly Bands for the DS for your entire collection, so let me know if you want to agree to that. The Game Boy Color is a weird one to even count as its own console. It came out in 1998, and it's really more of an upgrade to the original Game Boy than like a full new system. The graphics look basically the same outside the color. Even Pokemon Yellow, which came out right around the Game Boy Color's launch, gets filed under the plain Game Boy on price charting since it's really a Game Boy compatible cartridge, not an exclusive. 36 games qualify, and a huge chunk of this library is licensed games. Disney's Beauty and the Beast, 2 separate Mickey games, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, Quest for Camelot, Bugs Bunny, 2 separate Hamtaro games. Pokemon Crystal is carrying the entire system financially, and it's worth being clear that this isn't a spin-off, it's just the enhanced third version of Gold and Silver. It's $166 loose and $846 complete, and that's more than double the most expensive complete game on here. Kirby Tilt and Tumble is up there at $70 loose and $220 complete, and it's actually the one game on this whole system with an actual tilt sensor built into the cartridge, and it's just a very unusual thing to find in a Game Boy Color game, whether or not it's the reason for the price. Both Zelda Oracle games land around $200 complete too. Meanwhile, the cheapest lowest complete game on the whole system is Disney's Beauty and the Beast, a board game adventure, which will run you $20. So the worst licensed board game tie-in and the mainline Pokemon entry both exist on the same piece of plastic, just over $800 apart. Add it all up and the loose total comes to $1,263, which is a $35 average, and complete in box it is just over $4,700, a $131 average. As a 2000s kid whose first system was a DS, I did not know what a Game Boy Advance was until I was around like 8 years old. I just thought the GBA games were bigger DS games, which in my defense is a reasonable assumption for a kid who never actually had a Game Boy Advance. Anyway, I wish I'd gotten into these as a kid more, because a lot of them are crazy expensive now. And worse, the handful I did buy back then, I got loose from GameStop instead of complete. The GBA was only Nintendo's primary handheld for like 3 years, but still got 67 games that qualify, which is the biggest handheld library so far in this video. Pokemon Emerald leads at 223 loose and 763 complete, though Ruby, Sapphire, Fire Red, and Leaf Green aren't cheap either. All 4 of those sit around $90 to $115 loose and north of 365 complete. So if the words Pokemon and Game Boy Advance appear on the same cartridge, just budget accordingly. Fire Emblem, the very first one to get a Western release, is $60 loose and $188 complete. Nintendo brought the series overseas for the first time in 2003. One more GBA entry followed 2 years later, and then the series jumped to GameCube for Path of Radiance, but this is the one that started it all, and now that the franchise has a much larger Western audience than it did in 2003, there's a much bigger crowd looking back at the game that introduced it here than there ever was when it actually came out. Drill Dozer is another one worth talking about. It's $100 loose for a game almost no people have heard of, and I haven't been able to find a real explanation on why that is. Nintendo also re-released a chunk of the NES library as its own GBA subset in 2004. You'll know this as the classic NES series. 12 games from Bomberman to Zelda 2, each on its own cartridge with its own box art, sold to celebrate the NES's 20th anniversary. Xevious is the cheapest complete Nintendo game on the entire GBA library at $22, and personally, I don't think anyone was clamoring to revisit that one specifically in 2004. I also want to mention WarioWare Twisted. That's $73 loose and $180 complete, and it's kind of like the same story with Kirby Tilt and Tumble. It has a gyro sensor built directly into the cartridge, and both of these hold up as 2 of the pricier cartridges on their respective systems. Add it all up, and loose total comes to $2,534, or a $38 average, and complete in box it is over $7,700 with a $115 average. And to no one's surprise, the Pokemon games here are what really inflates this. Alright, this is probably the one a lot of you clicked on this video for, and a lot of you probably skipped right here, so if that's you, hi. We all know why. It's because GameCube games are being sold for ridiculous amounts in 2026, and they really have been for the past few years. The GameCube sold around 21.74 million units worldwide, way behind the N64 before it at nearly 33 million, and nowhere close to the Wii after at over 100 million. So a smaller pool of buyers ever picked these games up in the first place, and a handful of specific games got stuck in exactly the wrong spot for it. Good enough to be beloved years later, unpopular enough at launch that hardly anyone was buying extra copies to begin with. Chibi Robo is a good example. You play as a 4-inch robot doing chores for a family who mostly ignores him. It's a very charming game, but as you probably could assume, sold pretty bad. Did not sell that well. And it came out late in the GameCube's life when almost nobody was still buying new games for the system at all. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, which I talked about before, also gets lumped in with it, but the actual story is a little different than you'd expect. Again, like I said, this was not the first Fire Emblem game in the West, but it was the first Fire Emblem game in the West on a home console. But poor sales and then the series just exploding in popularity later down the line has made this one of the pricier games on the system. Another thing I think caused GameCube prices to go up is that until literally last year, a lot of these games were just stuck on the GameCube. Like, yeah, the Switch 2 has GameCube Online, but before that, almost every single Nintendo game, besides a few that got remasters or remakes, have not had modern versions to play. The GameCube only has 50 Nintendo published games, which is roughly the same as the SNES library, and here Nintendo finally switched to plastic cases, like the same DVD style cases most disc-based games have used since. So the jump from loose to complete in box isn't nearly as brutal as it's been on older systems. Chibi Robo is 145 loose, Path of Radiance is 165, Twilight Princess 141, Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness 117 loose, and $200 complete, and none of that touches what's actually pulling the loose total up. Pokemon Box, Ruby and Sapphire is the reason, and it's less a game than a storage tool. One that let you shuffle Pokemon between your Game Boy cartridge and also play Ruby and Sapphire on your TV through the GameCube. Nintendo never put it on normal store shelves. In the US, it was restricted entirely to the Pokemon Center store in New York and the Pokemon Center website. Nintendo's own marketing called it the most exclusive Pokemon software ever offered to North American fans, which is a strange thing to say proudly about a glorified save file manager, but congratulations, you've built one of the most expensive quote-unquote games in Nintendo history. It's $1,500 loose, $2,300 complete, and this one disc sold through exactly one retail channel accounts for more than a third of the entire GameCube system's loose total by itself. I'd actually really love to build up my GameCube collection someday, since my collection's pretty small right now, but knowing that number exists makes it hard to justify spending money on anything past the games I actually want to play. However, you could definitely argue that this game shouldn't count. Regardless, for what it's worth, the cheapest complete GameCube games on the whole list is NBA Courtside 2002 at just $11, barely more than it costs loose, and there's plenty of games that aren't super expensive. Mario Sunshine you can get around $40, same for Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Luigi's Mansion is around $50, and then you have that pricier zone which isn't too crazy like Smash Melee, Mario Kart Double Dash, some of the Mario parties, all of which go between around $60 to $80. Adding up the loose price, this is the most expensive collection we've covered so far in this video. Around $3,900 to get every game, a $78 average, and more than $1,000 higher than the Game Boy Advance, which is the previous record holder. However, if we want to take out Pokemon Box, it's $1,500 cheaper at $2,400, but honestly, it's really up to you whether you want to consider it or not. But now for the complete in box total, that climbs to $5,663, a $113 average, and a premium of just over $1,700. Compare that to the NES, where the complete in box premium alone was over $9,000. The DS was my first console ever, and it's got the biggest library of any system we've covered so far in this video. That totals 102 games. Looking back at what I bought as a kid, I mostly picked up Mario games, and I just want to travel back in time and slap myself in the face for it, because the games that turned out to be worth something here are almost all Pokemon. Platinum, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, Black and White 2, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. They make up nearly every expensive entry on this list, while Diamond and Pearl by comparison are the cheap ones, both only under $85 loose. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are the two most expensive loose games on the systems at $149 and $140, and Soul Silver takes the complete in box crown at $237. I think one reason for this discrepancy might be that people want this actual case because it has a cool glossy effect on it. Another reason is that both originally came packed with the Pokewalker, a little pedometer that let you walk your Pokemon around in real life and earn items, and price charting actually tracks a separate pricier listing for copies that still have it, which isn't the number I'm using here, but it's worth knowing that complete gets more complicated on these two than it does almost anywhere else in the video. Also, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky isn't far behind at $100 loose and $173 complete. It's the enhanced third version of Explorers of Time and Darkness, the same basic idea as Crystal or Emerald, and it's the one people point to as the good one. There's a lot of cheap filler buried in this library too. This was a system Nintendo tried to sell to literally everyone, not just gamers. You had weird experimental games like Electroplankton, where you make music by poking at animated plankton, and it's $51 loose and $65 complete, which is a lot for a game with no marketing push and no real physical sequel. Like, yeah, it had some DSi games. Then there were a bunch of games that were just like software, like Personal Trainer Cooking, which is $5 complete. Crosswords DS is $5 complete. Brain Age 2 $6, and I don't think anyone's fighting over used copies of America's Test Kitchen Let's Get Cooking, which is also $5 in the cheapest game here. Someone just buy this game and set it free at this point. I think it's just really funny to see these games on the DS as a less handheld release before the popularization of smartphones. Just feels like a completely different era because, I mean, it is, but I like to look back in this time. Anyway, I kept most of my cases from back then, so I'm at least glad I did that. Add it all up, and the total loose value across the DS games comes out to $2,880, or a $28 average, and complete in box at $4,500, which is a $44 average. Somewhat small numbers for the biggest library in this video, mostly because so much of it is budget software like this. The Wii was my first home console, and its library sits at 59 qualifying games. A handful of those are the Mario and Sonic Olympic games, which Sega actually publishes. They just make the cut because Mario's in the title. Everyone remembers this system for shovelware, and I mean, that's fair. Like, there's a lot of it. Like, a lot. But on the games that do meet our rules, there's actually a lot of really great games here, and just a lot of games in general. Surprisingly, Rhythm Heaven Fever is the single most expensive Wii game in this whole video, both loose and complete at $110 and $152 respectively, and the irony is that it launched in North America in February 2012 at a deliberate $30 budget price, less than a year before the Wii U, and that deliberately cheap late generation release is now the most expensive game in the whole set. Nintendo tried to make this one accessible and accidentally made it the chase card of the whole library, and this game went complete in box for under $10 in the early 2010s, and even before 2020, you could get it for under 30 bucks. So you never know what game is going to just randomly shoot up in value someday. Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn is close behind at 99 and 122. That's the Wii version of the Path of Radiance problem from the GameCube chapter in just every way that matters. It's the direct sequel released in November 2007 to the same still developing Western Fire Emblem audience. Then you also have the Metroid Prime trilogy, which released in August 2009 to great reviews. It was a collection of the 3 Metroid Prime games, but then for some reason it was discontinued in January 2010, just 5 months later, for reasons I haven't been able to find. It did eventually come back digitally on the Wii U eShop in 2015, so the game itself was never actually gone, and now that disc is $90 loose and $115 complete. But beyond those 3, most of the library is pretty cheap here. There's some pricier ones like Wii Party at $57, Mario Party 9 at $44, Kirby's Dream Collection Special Edition at $44, Mario Super Sluggers at $40. So there's a real second tier above the absolute bargain bin. But Wii Sports, Mario Galaxy, Smash Bros. Brawl, Mario Kart Wii, they all sit comfortably under $35 complete. And the cheapest games here are all under $10, like Big Brain Academy Wii Degree, Wii Fit Plus, and Fling Smash. Oh, then there's also a random game I forgot even existed called Mystery Case Files: The Malgrave Incident, and that sits at just $11. Being my first home console, doing this math was the first time I realized how cheap it would actually be to build out a full Wii shelf compared to almost anything else in this video. Add it all up, and the total loose value for all 59 games is just under $1,300, or a $22 average, and complete in box, it only climbs to $1,600, or a $27 average. For how many games, that is surprisingly cheap. Like, yeah, $1,600 isn't just quote-unquote cheap, but compared to everything else here, and with the amount of games you're getting, like, yeah, that's pretty good value. The 3DS might be the most fun system in this video to collect for, or maybe the least fun for some, mostly because it's also got 100 games, and an unusually large number of them are expensive for reasons that don't always make obvious sense. Kid Icarus Uprising is entirely my own fault. I actually got it for free with some Club Nintendo reward back in the day, but the issue was, it was a digital code. Anyone who watches my channel knows I very, very rarely buy digital games, but with my own luck, it's now one of the priciest games on the system at $50 loose and $73 complete. And every time I look at that number, I think about the physical copy sitting on some shelf that isn't mine. However, it's not all bad because I do have Tomodachi Life, which goes for $80 loose and $90 complete. I got it used in like 2014 for like 30 bucks or so thanks Joe for recommending this game to me. However, none of that touches the holy grail of the system though. Level 5 developed Yokai Watch 3, but Nintendo published it in North America, so it qualifies, and it is $435 loose, $500 in the box for a game that came out in Japan in 2016, but Nintendo didn't bring to North America until February of 2019, so it was already 2 years after the Switch launch, so you can guess why this game is so expensive now. There's 3 other Yokai Watch entries that are also expensive. Blaster's Red Cat Corpse is $205 loose and $260 complete, White Dog Squad is $199 and $264, and Psychic Spectres is $219 loose on its own. So if you were a kid who got really into that specific franchise instead of Pokemon, congrats, you accidentally made a much worse investment than the rest of us, or a great investment if you were there from the beginning. Another weird one is Style Savvy Fashion Forward, which is another one that came out of nowhere for me at $102 and $112 complete. Also Metroid Prime Federation Force, which people hated, goes for $70 loose and $92 complete now. This was another game that was dirt cheap until the past couple years for whatever reason. The total loose value for the whole first-party 3DS library comes out to $3,500, giving us some easy math with a $35 average. Complete in box, it's going to be over $4,100 or a $41 average, and I actually have a pretty sizable 3DS collection, but yeah, I think I'm good on trying to complete that collection. This is really the system that started this whole video. The Wii U only has 40 Nintendo published physical games, which makes it the smallest home console library we've covered so far in this video, and I'm only a handful of games away from having every single one of them. Most of the ones I'm missing are super cheap, like Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge, it's just $8 loose and $8 complete, Sing Party, which is $6 and $8, Wonderful 101 is $17 and $20, but none of these games are standing between me and completion for any other reason than I just haven't gotten around to picking them up yet. There's a few that are a little pricier. Game & Wario at $62 loose, $80 complete. Mario and Sonic at the Sochi 2014 Olympic Winter Games at $80 and $131, even though that's an asterisk since the only listing available was bundled with a controller. And there's also Twilight Princess HD, which is $123 loose and pretty much the same at $125 complete. But fortunately, I got this on launch day with the Wolf Link amiibo. And then there's Devil's Third, on a completely different planet from the rest of the library. It is $213 loose and $230 complete, and it's a game most people have never played. Nintendo published it in North America, though it was developed by Valhalla Games game studios, not Nintendo themselves. And the North American release came with 0 advance review copies sent to press, and the launch was pretty much buried at the bottom of a routine weekly download update. There's so few physical copies that within days people were reselling them on eBay for $150 to $400 a piece. For a game nobody wanted at launch, the used market truly does not care about your feelings. It's wild that a single Nintendo published Wii U game costs more to own than most of the good games people actually care about on the system combined. It doesn't seem as bad though when you realize it was going for $500 in early 2022. So maybe, just maybe, it'll get a little cheaper over time, but who knows. The total loose value for all 40 Wii U games comes out to just under $1,100 or a $27 average. Complete, it's $1,242, an average of $31. The premium for complete in box is only $168, making it the smallest dollar gap of any console we've covered so far in this video. Unlike pretty much every console we've talked about in this video so far, the Wii U is one I realistically can finish someday, because yeah, Game & Watch is a little pricey. Wii Sports Club is another one that's a little up there, but since it's only a handful of games, I could deal with it. It's really just Devil's Third, and if I actually really want to pay that price. The Switch is by far my biggest Nintendo collection at this point, and it's sitting around 80 games or so. Since it's still an actively supported system, a lot of these are still selling close to full retail price, even used, though you can find deals if you know where to look. 118 games qualify here, and that is the biggest Nintendo library covered anywhere in this video, even bigger than the DS. At around 80 games owned total, I already have more than half for the qualifying games, since a lot of them aren't Nintendo games, but honestly, wouldn't it be crazy for me to someday have a complete collection, especially since none of the prices are really that insane yet. In fact, the only example I can find of a Nintendo published Switch game selling above its original retail price is Super Mario 3D All-Stars, which launched at $60, got pulled from shelves after a limited run, and now sits at $70 loose and $80 complete. But I got that on launch day, so we're good. It's also worth looking at Ring Fit Adventure. It only ever sold bundled with the Ring Con and leg strap accessories at $80, and the current $45 complete price is a little over half that. I actually have that game, which I got for cheap, but not the accessory, but I would say you just need the game for the complete collection. And then you have plenty of other games, like ARMS launched at $60 and it's $24 now. The Origami King launched at $60 and is $27 now. However, Nintendo still charges $60 for these games, but if you know where to look, you can get them for more than half off. This is why it's so important to hunt for deals rather than go to a retail store, because most of these games still go for full price, like I said. Breath of the Wild came out in 2017 and Nintendo still sells it for $60. And it also shows why physical games are so important, because it creates some competition and choice. Without that, you would be forced to pay whatever price Nintendo wants you to pay, and their games just do not lose much value on the first-hand market. Now, add it all up, and the loose total comes out to $3,500 across all those games, which is a $30 average. And complete in box is just over $3,900, so a $33 average. It's a premium of just $431, since most people are still going to have their Switch cases since this console isn't that old yet. Plus, I don't really know too many people who actually throw away their Switch cases. Despite being one of Nintendo's newest consoles, having the biggest library, and still having a lot of their games be full price on the first-hand market, Nintendo's Switch library isn't really that crazy, just because you don't have any crazy outliers. Plus, it isn't much more expensive to get the cases too. And now finally, we are at the Nintendo Switch 2, which has only been out for a little over a year, so there's only 17 games that qualify. But even though it's been out for such a short time, you can still actually find decent deals if you know where to look. The most expensive complete release is the Super Mario Bros. Wonder Switch 2 edition bundle with the Meetup in Bell Bell Park expansion, and you can find that for around $60, which is already $20 cheaper than the launch price at $80. Mario Kart World is the most expensive loose game at $57, and Kirby Air Riders and Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, both of which launched at $70, are already down to $45 and $47 complete less than a year after release. None of these numbers are going to mean anything in like 5 years. They're just what a brand new system looks like before the resale markets had much time to shift. So there's really not much to say here, but if you want to add up the total loose value, it's $824, which is a $48 average. Complete in box, it's $868 at a $51 average, so a premium of just $44 across the entire system. Loose and complete costing around the same thing right now makes a lot of sense, because I mean, if you've already bought a Switch 2 and thrown out or lost some of the cases, like, I don't know what to tell you. One thing worth knowing if you care about physical ownership going forward, and of course this has been a big topic, is that Nintendo Switch 2 game key cards don't actually hold the full game, but it's just a license that makes you download it the first time you pop it in. So that card still has to stay in the system every time you play it. And so far, Nintendo themselves has not developed any games that are not on the cartridge. However, Pokemon Pokopia is published by Nintendo and is so far the only game key card that they've published. It does deserve a lot of criticism, but at least it's much better than the alternative, which is no physical media, which we see Sony doing. But anyway, I'm really enjoying my Switch 2 so far, and I'm looking forward to building out a physical collection of it. I know a lot of people may have problems with Nintendo, but as long as they continue to support physical media, they're already way better than Sony in my opinion as a company. Zooming out across every system in this video, the pain of collecting Nintendo has almost nothing to do with how old a console is, and almost everything to do with print runs, formats, whichever weird one-off game a franchise decided to attach itself to, 2 NES cartridges, a tiny robot game, and a Pokemon storage app on GameCube, a 5-month discontinuation nobody at Nintendo ever explained on Wii. Meanwhile, that same Wii, a system practically nobody respects as a collectible, comes in cheaper to complete than either the GameCube or the SNES on their own, despite having more games than each of those systems individually. Add up every single system in this video, all 830 games across 14 consoles, and the total loose value comes out to approximately $27,445. Complete as price charting defines it for each release, it's approximately $65,143. Split by category, home consoles account for roughly $37,576 of that complete total, and portable makes up roughly $27,566. So despite everyone assuming this whole video is going to be thinking about the GameCube or Nintendo 64, the portables that you thought might have been a fraction of the home consoles still make up a big chunk of this total, especially when you factor in complete in box. So that is the real price of a complete physical Nintendo collection, every release that meets our rules, North America only, prices pulled on July 14th, 2026. Making this video was very interesting to me because as someone who's been collecting Nintendo games since I was a kid, I've always wondered how much it would actually cost to buy every Nintendo game. And while I can say completing most of these collections is just unrealistic for me unless I make millions of dollars, there are a couple of consoles on here that really aren't too far-fetched. If I really wanted to have every Wii game I could, the Wii U I'm only a few games away from, and even with the Switch having the largest library, I only have around a third of that collection left. And also, who knows where these prices are going to be in a couple of years. If we go back before 2020, the total cost, I can guarantee you, was way less than what it is today. Anyway, I just want to say big thank you to Fritter from Fritter's Game Shine. Go check out his channel if you like game collecting. And also, this video took a ton of work to find out all these prices, so I would really appreciate if you like and subscribe. Now, I want to hear some of your game collecting stories in the comments. Now, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.